What are they on, nitrous oxide?
They are insane for the Ghostwood Estates project. I have had more serious fun in 2 days with these Nordic animals. And Ben, I'm in love. Her name is Hepa. She's a giant snow queen with a smile like a sunrise on an ice floe. You could go blind looking at this girl. Look at this. You see what she gave me? An entire leg of lamb.
Jerry,
Is that beautiful?
Jerry, come on.
What? You crushed some garlic, some fresh mint. That's rotisserie heaven. Come on, you gotta meet her. That's rotisserie heaven. 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 That's rotisserie heaven.
Quick, think of a dumb magic joke. This is Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, Last Pick Puppet Conjurer Maddox.
I had to do it.
Did you just do it?
You can't fault me for it.
Did you just do it because you didn't want me to lord over you moving forward? That Puppet Conjurer didn't even get drafted in our rotisserie draft of your regular cube?
I definitely see why you would frame it that way. It's not unrelated to that. I mean, I love the card. It's not in my main deck. I shouldn't tell you that, actually. We haven't played yet.
Oh, yeah, it's really going to affect my lines if I know you have a Puppet Conjurer in your deck.
You're going to save that shock just for my Puppet Conjurer. I know.
Yeah, I'll keep this 6-land opener because you have Puppet Conjurer in your deck, so I can't lose.
Look,
it doesn't really matter.
let's just put it this way. The card's in my cube because I love it, and I have to take it for the same reason.
Fair enough.
All right.
Do you expect you are ever going to side it in once?
So just based on the way other people's...
What matchups is Puppet Conjurer really shine in, Anthony?
The matchups where it really shines is when your opponent has, a big, not trampling creature that you want to chump block forever.
Do you want to read the text of Puppet Conjurer for our listeners that might not know this iconic card?
Read it. I can tell it to you from memory.
Great,
maybe.
I can.
Check me on this. It's 1 and a black for a 1/2 wizard. I'm going to say human wizard. And it has...
There's one important part of that type line that you're missing that I know you know.
Artifact creature human. It's an artifact wizard?
Yeah, it's an artifact human.
It is an artifact wizard. That's very important, which is why I remember it. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, you must sacrifice a homunculus. It has blue, tap, create a 0/1 homunculus creature. So it's sort of like Ophiomancer. It's a lot like Ophiomancer, except the creature doesn't have death touch. It doesn't even have any power. And it's kind of the opposite, where you have to pay to keep it around, and if you don't pay, you just don't get your homunculus.
You have a smattering of changelings in your cube. Has this come up yet, where somebody's been forced to sacrifice their changeling inadvertently by their Puppet Conjurer?
I look forward to the day.
Of course it hasn't come up. Nobody's ever played Puppet Conjurer in your cube except for you.
It's mostly true. It's mostly true.
Here's what I'll grant you about Puppet Conjurer. I do think this card is better than people give it credit for.
Mm-hmm.
If it was not a gold card, I think it would actually maybe be fine in your cube. The
fact
that you
definitely
have to
agree.
be in black-blue, it makes it really, really rough. Especially because your cube, one thing I really like about it, compared to other cubes, is that you actually, I think, maintain a pretty good delta in power level between gold cards and non-gold cards of the same CMC, which is possible because you're at a lower power level, so you can actually just play better gold cards, which those of us that are playing at the limits of power, we just can't play gold cards that are better than Lightning Bolt or Dark Confidant or whatever. It's not an option because those cards have never been printed. I like that about your cube, and so putting it through that lens, if you compare Puppet Conjurer to any of your other blue-black gold cards or anything in any other guilds, I don't think it holds up, unfortunately.
I think you're right. I mean, it does do stuff, though. I really actually enjoy it if you're going like full Grixis artifacts with not Goblin Welder, but Goblin Engineer. That's what it's called, right? Because Goblin Engineer actually lets you tutor it and put it into the graveyard, and then it lets you use those little homunculi to fuel it, and you can draw a bunch of cards if you have some Chrome Sphere or some other incidental artifact.
That's right. 4 cards in 3 colors, and you've got yourself the equivalent of a draw an extra card turn. What's that artifact?
D+. We'll call it a D+, and leave it at there.
Oh, I can't remember the name of the artifact. It's 4 mana, and it has the Will of the Council, but it doesn't matter because you always choose the one that lets you draw a card.
Portal?
Thank you so much. It's just a 4-card, 3-color coercive portal where most of the pieces are not that playable on their own.
However, some of the pieces are interchangeable, and one of the pieces tutors the other piece, so it actually works. Like I've actually done that, and it works. Again, still, it's not the most powerful thing you can do in this environment, but it's a thing you can do.
We're going to spend a lot of time on this episode talking about your regular cube, Anthony, because we completed a rotisserie draft of it this past week and are in the midst of playing games now. This is the first time doing a roto draft of any of your cubes, right?
That's correct.
I find it to be a very enlightening experience as a cube designer. I really recommend it to anybody out there that's got a cube. Find 7 people that are willing to draft it with you, because you learn so much from both the picks, what people actually take, and also all the conversations surrounding the picks, which you have kind of as the picks are going down. So I think it's a lot of fun. And I know from talking to you, you've also learned a lot from this. So we're going to talk about this rotisserie draft, what you've learned from it as a designer, and all the sort of branching conversations that come from that. So Anthony, because we're talking about the regular cube, I think we should do a pack one, pick one from the regular cube, which we haven't done in a while. Apologies to all of our listeners submitted pack one, pick ones waiting in the queue, but you can get on that queue if you want by mail at luckypaper.co and send us a link to your cube and your pronouns, and we will put it on our queue and do it in the future. But this episode is all about the regular cube, Anthony, so let's do a pack one, pick one from that.
All right, I've got a pack for you. Are you ready?
Are you going to read the pack? This is so exciting. I'm always reading the pack. Now I get to sit here and just really think about it.
Yeah, I'll read a pack. I think I can manage reading a couple cards. All right, first up, we've got Flux Channeler.
It'd be funny if you said, I think I can manage reading a couple cards, and then you were like, all right, first up, Flux Channeler, and then Nasting Dragoon. It would have been a good bit.
How did you know? Next up is Nesting Dragon. Prismatic Vista, Negate, Palaka Worm, Scrap Trawler, Obnixilus the Hate Twisted, Neutralize, Merchant of the Veil, with Haggle, Feat of Resistance, Goblin Crater Maker, Prophetic Prism, Fungal Rebirth, Malefic Scythe, and Band Together.
Well, Anthony, as regular listeners to this show will know, it's going to be hard to get me off Prismatic Vista, because it's about as open as one can get. It's a nice fixing land. It's going to go on my deck no matter what. But getting more and more familiar with this cube the more I play it, and I think I also learned a lot as a player. I've played your cube many times, but from talking about this roto draft with other players, I think the degree to which synergy really does matter. Synergy became even more apparently clear. So on pure raw power level, I think Nesting Dragon is the next best card in this pack. I'm not thrilled to start on a 5-drop that's got 2 pips of devotion on it, just because if red is not open, it's going to be a bummer that I didn't take that Prismatic Vista. So that's going to keep me off of that. And then I do think that I'm looking at cards like Scrap Trawler differently now than I used to, because that's a card that is a very important tool in the Artifact Matters deck, but it's similarly committal, I think, right? It's a colorless card, but it is actually committing as much or more to a deck than Nesting Dragon is, because you need to be drafting a specific kind of deck for that card to actually work. So cards like Scrap Trawler are standing out a little more to me than they did perhaps previously. But yeah, I'm still on Vista over Dragon and Scrap Trawler, I think.
Yeah, I'm definitely in the same place as you with the top 2 picks. I mean, Nesting Dragon, overall this cube has a pretty flat power level. There are definitely some cards that really perform when you have the right synergy, you're really building around it. Nesting Dragon stands out as one of the cards that you don't really need to build around. It's just a sweet dragon that makes a dragon egg whenever a land enters the battlefield. I think I would probably take the Nesting Dragon over the Vista, but it's very, very close.
Yeah, I mean, it is, in terms of raw power outliers, it's near one of the better cards in the cube. I think it's pretty safe to say. So if we imagine, I always like to think that in pretty much every cube, there is a narrow class of cards you will take over the best fixing. It's just whatever the best cards are, if they're enough better than the rest of the cube, it's probably worth taking over a fixing land. I don't think Nesting Dragon is there for me. If this was as powerful, as relatively powerful, but was a 3-drop or something, or maybe just, 1 less pip of red, I might be more into it, but it's pretty committal for me, so I'm going to take the Vista and go from there.
I can't do it. I'm just taking the Dragon. It's Dragon time.
Now, I assume this Dragon is in this cube because you must really love it, but I've never heard you wax poetic about what you like about Nesting Dragon.
I mean, it's just such a great flavor. Honestly, Dragon Egg is a card that I really, really loved when we started playing Magic. It's just the right amount of build around for me, where it's okay, I'm going to play this little Dragon Egg, but as soon as it dies, I get a dragon. So I get to block once. If there's any opportunity to sacrifice it, I can get extra value from it. And then, so that combination of, landfall is another theme here. Here's a card that has landfall and has this outlet to interact with this other thing that is sort of has opportunities to play and sort of structure turns in interesting ways. All of that adds up to a really good card for me. I mean, I will say it's
a weird
like
flavor
definitely...
when you think about it. So I guess dragon eggs don't have a gestation period. If you leave them alone, they just never hatch, and then as soon as you hack into bits with a sword, your dragon is born.
I think that's canon, yeah. Like think
I'm
of
not gonna
dragon
argue
eggs
about dragon
in the
canon.
lore. You just keep them for thousands of years and then walk into a fire with them or something, and they turn into dragons, right?
That sounds like a Game of Thrones thing, but I never watched that show. It turns out I was right not to watch it because everyone got mad at how it ended. So I could see the future. I knew it was going to end bad and everyone was going to be disappointed. I didn't want to have that emotional journey.
You lucked out.
All right, well, let's just segue right into our normal conversation. That's our Pack 1 Pick 1. Anthony's going to take the dragon because the pull of making dragon eggs on landfall is too strong for him. I'm going to take the Vista because I'm a safe coward. Send us your cubes. We'll do your cubes on the air as well. Anthony, where do you want to start off our conversation about the Roto Draft?
Maybe we should just explain a little bit what a rotisserie draft is.
That is a great place to start. You're such a good host of a podcast.
Just kind of think about what stuff people might not know.
Have you ever heard it called a Rochester draft? That's the original name for this kind of draft, I believe.
Yeah, I have heard that. I feel like wasn't that actually when Magic was new and young? They were like, well, we could do drafts of these cards. That was just the way they thought it was always going to work, and before they even invented Booster Draft. Is that true, or am I making that up?
I think it is one of the earliest types of draft. According to the mtgfandom.com page right now, it came about because the R&D invented the draft format and first showed it off in Rochester, New York in late 1993. So that's
that makes sense.
Very, very early in the history of Magic. So yeah, I think it's one of the earliest kinds of draft, perhaps even before the idea of passing packs around a table was established as a thing.
And it's really simple. I think, isn't this even how like drafts in, sports work? Where
I think it is how drafts in sports work. I mean, people will not be surprised to know that we are not sportsmen. The two guys hosting the Magic the Gathering podcast, not big into sports. Though I will say, Anthony, I was ruminating today on just how much I know about sports only because I played video games growing up, and sports video games is such a big category of video games. So I can say definitively that this is how pretty much all drafts in professional sports work, is that you have a big giant pool of players, you take whichever one you want if you're the first round pick, and you just, goes through the entire league like that.
So that's it. We just have 8 players. We have the entire cube at our disposal, at our whatever, what's the right way to say it? We have the whole cube at our fingertips, and we can just choose whatever card we want and try and build the best deck. Importantly, it is face up. You know every card that every other player has taken, which means you're not making these early speculative picks. You're not trying to be safe and take the Prismatic Vista because you're not sure what colors are going to be open. You know exactly what the players around you are doing, and that really changes the dynamic of the draft.
Well, to be fair, you can still play it safe and take early fixing. Like in the first couple picks, it's not always clear what everyone's trying to do. I feel like there's a whole panoply of different kinds of first round picks in a rotisserie draft. There's some people that are like, screw it, I'm taking this signpost card that maybe isn't even the most powerful thing I could be doing, but it's going to very clearly signal that this is my lane. Everyone should stay out of it because I'm taking these kinds of cards no matter what. You have the kind of stay open but take a powerful card people. You have the take fixing and wait and see people, which I think is a totally reasonable way to start a rotisserie draft as well.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, there's a lot of ways to go, but that public information is definitely going to influence you. And where you are in the pick order really also affects the way the cube is going to go, because if you're picking last, you already have a good sense of what other people might be trying to do. Whereas if you're first, you're in that position where you're trying to balance, do you want to stay flexible or do you really want to set down a signpost and try and plant your flag?
And importantly, I don't think you mentioned this, but the way we've always done rotisserie drafts, and I'm not sure how canonical this is with the format, is we snake the pick order. So player 1 picks a card all the way through to player 8, but then player 8 picks 2 cards. They take the last card of the first round and the first card of the second round, and then it goes player 7, player 6, and it snakes back around. And then when it gets all the way back to the first player, they then get 2 consecutive picks as well in rounds 2 and 3. So that dynamic is interesting. Every player at the table has a long and a short way around the table, right? Where they are going to get to make a pick, and then either nobody's going to get to pick again because they're on the very ends, or just one person's going to get to pick again. And then they have a longer road around the table where they have to wait and see what other players are doing. And so I think that the cards you pick, depending on which direction the snake is currently going, is also a dimension I'm always thinking about.
Totally, and it's structured that way specifically so that, first player doesn't just have a huge advantage and the person who's in 8th place, it's just, 8 picks behind, they get that opportunity to get that double pick, which balances things out and adds a really interesting sort of texture to the draft. So in this case, I was drafter number 8, so I had an opportunity to really plant my flag and take 2 picks in a row that put me into a specific archetype and signal to everybody else to stay out of my way.
Which, to be fair, drafter 7 could have done almost exactly the same thing as long as you didn't get in that lane, because they
so
also had
scales,
2 consecutive picks, only broken up by you, exactly, right?
For sure, yeah. So it sort of scales where everybody later in the sequence gets a little bit of an extra boost over the people in the early. So I almost think actually like 1st and 8th might be the strongest positions, but it's definitely more fair and less clear what the optimal positions are than if you just did a straight, circle around the table.
Yeah, every time I do it, I change my mind on what I think the best spots to be are. It always feels a little bit different, depending on the cube, I think, too. Like,
totally.
Synergy is more important than being an end seat is nice, because you get to guarantee that you're going to get these 2 card synergies, basically. But again, the 2 seats just in from the end have a similar advantage. It's pretty rare that you're going to take a card, pass to the first player, and they're going to just use one of the picks to hate draft you or something. You're going to get that second card you want almost every time. And then if the cube has a big delta in power level, like if we're doing a vintage cube rotisserie, then I think you want to be earlier on, because you're just going to get power. The 8th person in a rotisserie with a vintage cube is not going to get a Mox or Black Lotus, right? They're going to be stuck with the lowly Time Walk or something, which is a much worse place to be than getting some free mana. Yeah,
in vintage cube you get to both stay open and have the most powerful card when you're in the first place.
Yes, that's the power of Black Lotus, or Mana Crypt, I guess maybe would even be a higher pick. Soul Ring.
I've heard it's good.
So that's what Rotisserie Draft is. We've done it in paper with my cube once, which was really very fun. It was my birthday or something that I convinced everyone to indulge me in this. But we actually laid the entire cube out on a giant table and, spent a long time drafting, and it took a long time, but it was fun.
Literally hours.
It was fun to drink and, take cards and stuff. But this has been something we've really done quite a few times since we've been playing entirely online, because we do it asynchronously. So we have a spreadsheet set up, and Anthony, could we link to is your spreadsheet template ready? Could we link to it in the show notes here at the very least?
Let's link to the spreadsheet, and also as a template that you can copy for your own rotisserie drafts. You paste your cube in, it does all kinds of fancy stuff of automatically coloring your picks and checking them off the list. And then let's also share just a copy of this specific draft so people can see what ended up getting drafted.
Absolutely. We'll put them both in the show notes for this show, which you can find at luckypaper.co/podcast/35. Is that right? Is this the 35th episode of this show, Anthony?
I have zero idea.
It is, /35. Your nickname was almost going to be Spreadsheet Wizard, except you took that last pick, Puppet Conjurer, and I had to rub that in your face a little bit. But this spreadsheet Anthony put together is pretty brilliant. It auto-completes and, lets people actually match the exact spelling of a card, and it checks it off of lists from the cubes. People can go and check and see what still hasn't been taken without having to go through the entire pick sheet. So we've been doing a lot of rotisserie drafts. A lot is still relative. It take a long time. The first one we did of my cube, which we talked about in this show, took almost 2.5 weeks. This one went a lot faster. I don't know why. Maybe just, I don't know. Who knows why. It takes a little while to do it asynchronously, but, you get in the Discord with your friends and chat about the picks and talk a little trash, and it's a lot of fun. So, again, I do want to highly recommend this to anybody that has never done it before. It's a ton of fun, and you do learn a lot, I think. So let's transition anything into what you learned, maybe, or whatever you want to talk about with this rotisserie draft.
So the biggest thing I actually wanted to highlight and put out there is just that this was a blast. This was so much more fun than I expected. We've done rotisserie drafts mostly of these higher powered cubes where people are really excited to, first pick these really broken cards. Like, if not actual power, it's, Jace the Mind Sculptor and Oko. So I kind of suggested this pretty meekly. I was like, well, my cube's low power. I don't know how much people are going to be interested in this. But it ended up being just a ton of fun. Like, the picks were extremely dynamic. There was a lot of people stepping on each other's feet or, fighting for certain cards or certain kinds of effects that are pretty scarce in the environment. And that just ended up being a ton of fun.
I think it's great. And I love you. You do a lot of things a little bit meekly. And you did present this like, I don't know, it's not going to be any fun, but if you want to draft it, we can. I think you just got to step up. Of course it's going to be fun. People love playing Magic. And I think it's just, it takes a little bit of, confidence to just seize the room and say, guess what? Everyone's going to look at my cube for the next 2 weeks while we're doing this rotisserie draft. But yeah, it was a ton of fun. I agree. I, however, do have to say that I did pack one, pick one, a broken card, because I was the first seat in the draft, which means I got to take Booster Tutor, and I have yet to cast it meaningfully in any of my games, but I'm sure when I do, it's going to prove itself to be broken.
I said in the Slack, we're all trash talking in the Discord. Let's set a goal. Somebody else needs to cast Booster Tutor before this draft is over, before we do our complete round robin. I want somebody to use Gonti or Direfleet Daredevil and cast Andy's Booster Tutor just because he was so excited about it. Guess what happened?
Game 1, match 1. My opponent says, Gonti, Ephemerate Gonti, steal your whole deck, and now I'll cast this Booster Tutor and go get this key card and kill you with it. Yeah, so far Booster Tutor has a good win rate, just I'm not the one casting it thus far.
I love to see it.
Very punishing, but I think that card is extremely good. I'm excited to cast it.
But I was specifically looking at the cube and thinking, okay, if we do this rotisserie draft, how is it actually going to shake out? What are the things people are going to take? I really kind of expected pack 1 just to be a big line of prismatic vistas and everybody to sort of be well, this is fine, glad we're doing this. But what turned out,
I was excited when you said that because I knew for sure that wasn't going to be the case. I just knowing our play group and knowing how they draft cubes, I was there's no way people are taking prismatic vistas that early. It's just not going to happen. And so I was all right, Anthony's going to have a lot of fun because he doesn't know what people are going to take. And it turns out, yes, the people did not take it until I think round 5 or 6 they started taking vistas. When was the great run on vistas?
It looks like picks 8 or 9.
Yeah, so it was a good bit through the draft that people finally did the Vista run.
So overall, I thought what was really interesting that the cube, I've been trying to develop this sort of structure where we have a lot of little overlapping synergies. And that's sort of maybe the biggest success for me that I saw, the design of the cube was working as I intended, was that people were really, leaning into these synergistic cards. And a lot of the early drafts really were about trying to take those flexible cards that were most critical to your deck that you thought other players also might be interested in. And you don't really see that dynamic happen when you're doing it in paper, or doing a normal booster draft. Is that what we want to call it? A booster draft, even when we're not opening boosters?
Yeah, I call that method of drafting where you have a pack, be it an actual physical pack or 15 cards from a cube you're calling a pack. I call that booster draft.
So just to see all of that kind of interplay happen face up and publicly was really, really interesting and extremely satisfying as the cube designer. And I've done some other forms of face up drafting in the past and seen it fail, so it's sort of, I think, a testament and a reward to the fact that, the cube has gotten a lot better.
What do you think was the spiciest round 1 or 2 pick, the one you were most surprised to see?
I was most surprised to see Feather the Redeemed taken by our good friend Daniel, friend of the pod.
Nothing Daniel could have taken would have surprised me. Well, I guess if Daniel took a Prismatic Vista, I would have been shocked. that would have really surprised me. But no, I was not totally shocked to see that go super early.
It is a legend, but I kind of expected at that point to say, somebody's going to draft the all-in Boros deck. And then, of course, he didn't. He kind of went in a different and honestly very interesting direction. Yeah, it was. I guess that was a little bit surprising. Maybe even actually, no, you're right. Allison's pick of Kess was a little bit more surprising. I definitely agree. It's one of those cards that's extremely high reward, one of the most powerful cards in the cube. But starting with a 3-color card is a bold statement.
I thought for sure I pack one, pick one Booster Tutor, and I was like, I'm gonna get Kess after this goes around the table. I'm like, Kess is a high pick, but I've already taken a black spell, and I don't think anyone else is going to be willing to take Kess this early. And I was wrong. Kess was taken. And also many other black cards were taken. A lot of black cards went before it came back to me. So my sending a single didn't really work. I gotta say, I was most surprised. I was a little shocked by the pick 2 Knight of the Reliquary, which I imagine must have delighted you because I know you love this card. It's the showcase art for your cube on Cube Cobra. But I was surprised to see that go so early. Even more so, Oketra's Monument was a round 2 pick.
Oketra's Monument is an interesting high pick because it pairs with White Mane Lion and also Core Skyfisher in one of the only real loops. The closest thing to a combo you can do in this cube is that sort of set of cards.
You do have persist combo in this cube. It must be stated. It does exist.
That's true.
It's very hard to combine. It's very, and I told you yesterday in hindsight, I wish I had just forced persist combo because I don't think anyone else would have taken the pieces that highly. So this is probably one of the only chances to actually get all of the pieces for a dedicated persist combo deck that would happen in your cube. Because, in a regular booster draft, it just never happens. Also, your cube is bigger than 360, so you don't even open all the pieces in every draft necessarily. Yeah. That could have been a thing.
Right, so that's sort of the next thing that I noticed, especially in the early picks, was people were very willing to jump into these really high synergy or build-around type cards in a way that is really hard to justify in a booster draft, which makes perfect sense because like you said, you open up the Oketra's Monument, you don't know if you're going to get the other pieces to make it work. Like, you're taking a pick that is very speculative. It is a real cost in your draft, and you might not get paid off for it. Here, the only thing you're battling against is the wits of your opponents, the other people in the draft. And if you can sort of get those combos together quickly, get those really strong synergy cards together in your early picks, you can really solidify a strong deck. And that really sort of set the tone and structured the whole draft in a way that, again, was really, really satisfying.
I had the first pick, like I said. I took Booster Tutor, kind of hoping to wheel Kess. I did not. And when it came back around to me, people had committed to things pretty hard. I mean, the first round picks here were, I took Booster Tutor, then it was Heirloom Blade, Gonti, Kess, Feather the Redeemed, Soul Herder, Lotus Cobra. You marked out a very clear lane by taking Mere Battlesphere and Traxos Scourge of Krug in the Artifact deck. And so by the time it came back around to me, I was like, wow, we have people that are committing to so many gold cards and very dedicated aggro cards or dedicated synergy cards. So I just took 3 Triumphs next. I decided I'm going to be the open seat at this table and wait and see what's actually open. I can splash Booster Tutor. It's fine to cast late in the game and just see what actually comes around. And I ended up in green because nobody else took any green cards, basically, with the exception of one player splashing a little green in their mostly red aggro deck. What did you make of that?
That was a little bit surprising. I don't want to read into it too much or take it too much as a sign that there's a problem. I think, honestly, people are undervaluing some cards, but maybe it's because they don't look quite as appealing. I think green is better than people think it is here.
I agree. I wonder if, your cube is lower power level, and compared to, like, my cube, for example, or, like, the MTGO cube, there's certain classes of cards you just kind of avoid entirely, and one of them is cheap mana dorks. You have, like, I think two mana mana dorks, maybe 3 if you count Hope Tender in the cube. There's no 1 mana dork, so there's no, like, real ramp deck where you're going to have a deck that has 8 or 9 ramp sources and your whole plan is to play bigger spells ahead of curve. It's not really a thing.
I think there are more than you're giving it credit, but, again, like we've talked about, there's a huge confirmation bias or familiarity bias. I think that feeds into part of the issue here. Like, the green cards just don't necessarily look like the things you would expect. Because there is, Lotus Cobra, Druid of the Cowl, Quirion Elves.
That's the 3 I'm thinking of.
Werebear, Voyaging Satyr.
Voyaging Satyr is the one on tap. So maybe I got that one confused with the other Satyr that put cards in your graveyard to get a land back. Maybe that's me misreading that card.
Too many Satyrs. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm definitely going to take that as a data point and continue to try and shape the cube, make those strategies appealing. Maybe, use this set of decks to do a little bit more aggressive, focused playtesting of trying to design what do I think the best green decks are and do they actually stack up against these other decks.
Well, yeah, what I was going to say is that I think maybe it's just that I agree people are underrating some of the green cards, and I capitalized on that in this draft. I think I got some very powerful green cards late that I'm happy to be playing. Yeah, I think it's just a matter of the strategy not being recognizable to people. People don't know what green is supposed to do, because your other, like your red, for example, you don't have Lightning Bolt, but you have other burn spells. It's like similar thing, just a different cost, but still performs the same role. Whereas you do have fewer mana dorks than most ramp cubes do. And, frankly, when a mana dork gets expensive enough, it doesn't actually perform the same role anymore. Like, burn spells that get more expensive, it's still going to be killing a thing or dealing damage to your opponent, and that's relevant at kind of any stage of the game. Ramp's value really trails off, so you don't have just more expensive versions of mana dorks here, because at 4 mana, it doesn't make sense anymore. It's like, why am I playing a 4 mana mana dork when I can play a 4 mana threat? So I wonder if it's just, like you said, recognizability of what the deck can do that is keeping people away from green.
Yeah, and I think also it's just sort of the interesting texture of the draft that I definitely agree with a lot of not agree. I shouldn't agree or disagree with people's picks. I understand why people see the power level of a lot of the first picks that were taken were of the most powerful cards in the cube. And then the person that's in seat 7 ended up taking Lotus Cobra first, which sort of signaled to me, well, I don't really want to be in green right next to this other green drafter. And then they ended up kind of just drifting and ended up mostly in mono red. So I think that sort of like one person signaling that they might be in green and then moving away from it, again, was just a little force that pushed people away from it.
Right, yeah. If they were already maybe a little on the fence about it, and then one of the premier green cards went in round 1, they might think, well, I'm off it now, finally. I'm just going to do something else.
Talking a little bit more about the fixing, I definitely expected a lot of the fixing to go a little bit sooner than it did. And that really made me think a lot about how you evaluate cards in the cube and how you need to sort of adjust that to other players' evaluations and adjust your picks accordingly. So that kind of makes me think of this experience that I've definitely heard a lot of other people that play a lot of Limited talk about, that if they play Limited or they play a cube, if they're playing in a pod with a bunch of less experienced players, they feel like that can have a huge negative impact on their own draft experience. Have you heard that kind of story before?
You know, I've never given it much credence. I have heard it, and the context in which I've heard it is a supposedly experienced player blaming their draft gone off the rails on inexperienced drafters around them. And they were drafting the right way and reading the signals, but because this ding-dong was not drafting properly and didn't know what they were doing, it like sent them the wrong signals, therefore their deck ended up bad. That's the only context I've really heard that in, and that, frankly, to me, just smacks of complaining. You're just whining and not taking any accountability for the fact that your draft went wrong. If you're the better player, you should have a better deck. That's just how that works.
For sure. But I think there are some interesting forces in there. So yeah, I think the easiest way to sort of break down, how that could happen is the player next to you is saying, well, here's a 3-mana 3/3. I'll take this because I don't know that removal is good. And then you end up thinking that a certain color is open because you're getting all the removal spells, which you expect to be, going first and second out of the pack. Which I could see happening, but I think more the issue there is that if players evaluate things differently, you'll just end up in a place where your draft can be very much skewed. So if we take specifically the example of if you're a player that values removal, not just a little bit, but a lot more highly than other players, I can absolutely see you sitting down at a table and ending up just saying like, well, all of these packs have removal. I'm going to keep like following my pick order. Again, I don't think this is a good strategy, but I think I'm trying to rationalize how this could happen. And then you end up with this like awkward deck that has so much removal, but you ended up just getting no creatures because the players next to you are just like, oh yeah, creatures are good. And I felt like
I for sure have definitely had retail draft formats where I just basically always ended up in the same color pair because my evaluations of cards were just slightly off from the aggregate table's evaluations of cards, such that I always thought some color was open. And like, we've talked about this before where you can't really talk yourself out of that. It's not like I look at the pack and I go, oh, my bias is telling me this card is better. I look at the pack and I go, the best card in this pack is once again blue. It just happens every time. And I think I'm drafting to the best of my ability, but you end up kind of forced into lanes. I think that can totally happen with cubes too, where the way a cube is curated and the way that your own biases as a player affect your card evaluation, you might just sit down and you could draft in good faith, 100 times and hit yourself with a Men in Black flash every time between, so you forgot your previous draft, and you would end up in the same color pair 90% of the time because you just evaluate those cards higher than other cards.
I mean, that's another bias, but I'm more trying to get at the fact that if you evaluate like a certain type of card differently than the rest of the field. So like the removal's maybe not as good of an example. Let's talk about lands. Let's say you really value fixing.
I do.
And if you're playing with the same pot of people that share sort of your similar card evaluation, you need to take the fetch lands and the shocks highly, and you'll end up with the right amount that you kind of want for your deck. If you end up drafting with a bunch of people that just do not share that evaluation, you might end up at the end of the draft, unless you react to that and adjust your picks, be like, well, I drafted literally 2/3 of my picks are lands because I just kept following the protocol that usually works among a different play group. Does that make any sense?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's the same thing I was describing. It's just a different instance of it, though.
Right. It's just where, what you're describing, I feel like you could just end up in the same good deck consistently, or, a deck that works.
Or in my case, not a good deck. Sometimes I'm drawn into color pairs that don't work in an environment.
Well, that's fair.
Like, I remember early on in Dominaria, I just kept ending up in, like, red-black mid-range, and it was not doing well for me because I was, at that point in my limited career, I was valuing any kind of removal very highly, even not the most efficient removal. And that set had a couple of like 4 and 5 mana removal spells in black and red. And I was just ending up with these decks that had no synergy. It was just removal and medium threats. And that was a set where you could get a lot further with an aggressive White Knights deck, even if you didn't have enough removal, or you get really far with a green-black Saprolings deck, even if you didn't have some of these other like bread and butter cards. And I wasn't seeing those lanes because I was so in this narrow scope of I need to take removal and efficient creatures, and that's what limited is.
Sure. I mean, but the point that I'm trying to drive at is more just that if you think like the most important thing is fixing, you absolutely have to have it. It doesn't mean you always have to take it as highly relative to other kinds of effects. You just need to adjust your evaluation so that you value those important things a little bit more than everyone else. So if I just spent the first 8 picks just taking prismatic vistas and nobody else is taking them, I think I would actually have ended up in a pretty bad spot. And I think I was in the problem where I valued them a little bit less than everybody else and ended up with not enough fixing. So my point is, I don't need to be black and white and say, oh, I should have taken fixing first because I really needed it. It's just that I need to evaluate it appropriately compared to the rest of the table.
Yeah. I mean, I enter every situation assuming that everyone I'm playing Magic with is a good player. Better than me is what I like to assume. Because I feel like anything else is only setting yourself up to, like, set a trap for yourself and fall into it. So
right, and I'm not trying to make value judgments. I'm trying to be clear about saying, like, we're just talking about how do the other people at the table evaluate cards. And that's so much what this rotisserie draft, because it's a public draft, ended up being about. You're trying to figure out, well, I really want this, Shelldock Isle just because I'm in blue, but I see these 2 other players might just take it at some other point. So I might actually take that over, a much more synergistic card for my deck because I'm worried it's going to disappear.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is if you are giving all of your opponents benefit of the doubt and assuming they're good players, then there isn't any difference in what you're describing than just trying to draft as well as you can with your own skills, right? If you are assuming
well, no,
everyone
that's
else
exactly
is
what
as
I'm
good or
saying.
better
I
than
don't
you.
think is true. I think if you just say, well, I'm going to stick to my protocol that works among a group of people that has one set of card evaluation and apply that to a different draft environment with different people, I think that can be less optimal.
Are you suggesting that, like, halfway through pack 1, you should say, wow, I'm still seeing fixing lands. It must be that everyone at this table undervalues fixing lands? Because that's the leap I'm saying that I don't make. Like, if I think fixing is good...
that's exactly what I'm saying. And that's really, like, when it can, like, in a limited environment, you really can start to get an edge on people when you can say, well, people undervalue this, so I'm not going to take it as highly because I can take the things that people are actually fighting for highly and know that I can get these a little bit later. It's not about outrunning the bear, it's just about outrunning the guy next to you.
I hear what you're saying, but to me that's a little too big brain because, again, like, I'm assuming everyone at the table is as good a Magic player as me or better. So if I'm looking at a pack and seeing that, oh, I think this thing is... I would never jump to, I assume everyone's underrating this because that would assume my evaluation is right and everyone else's evaluation is wrong. If I think a card is good, I'm just going to take it from my deck. Now, in the example you gave, I'm not going to hew to my heuristic above all else. Like, I'm not going to get to the end of the draft and be like, oops, I like fixing, and now I have 35 fixing lands in my pool and 10 non-land cards. Like, I'm going to adjust as things go on for what I think my deck needs. Every pick is its own little decision matrix.
Well, I don't even think it needs to be. I don't think it needs to even be a value judgment and say, like, your card evaluations are better or worse or they are wrong. It's just that in this environment, like, if everyone just sort of agrees, like, we need to take prismatic vistas first, you kind of need to be on board with that or else you're going to be in a bad spot. And if everybody is on the same page, well, we can take them 8th, then that's also fine. And that sort of leads to this, like, interesting kind of run on the bank mentality, which absolutely happened. One person took a prismatic vista in round 8, and then everyone else jumped on board and said, well, these are starting to go, we got to take them all. And I don't think that was wrong. I think that people seeing that resource was valued at that point and responding to it actually makes sense. And I think that does play out in repeated drafts of a limited environment or a cube as well. It's just here we got to see it in real time in one specific draft because everyone knew exactly where people were placing things in their pick order.
Well, but I don't agree because I think the open information changes this completely. I don't think it's similar at all to a closed information draft. Like, if we had polled all 8 of these players before the draft began and said, when do you think the prismatic vistas are going to go? Or, like, name what round you think the first prismatic vista is going to go in and what round you think the last prismatic vista is going to go in. And, I mean, we should be clear. Anthony has 8 copies of this card in his cube. So this is a card of which there are 8 copies of prismatic vista. So it's non-singleton for this one card. And it's probably the best fixing land in your cube. Would you say that? Is that safe enough to say?
Yeah, I think so.
It's certainly the most flexible. Anybody playing more than one color will play Prismatic Vista. So high picks in this environment under normal circumstances from a regular pack, as we saw in our pack 1 pick 1. I think if you polled all of these players, I don't think the average would have been around rounds 8 or 9 where they actually went. I think we were all playing a game of chicken with each other, and it was just who's going to be the first one to blink and take a Prismatic Vista. And to be clear, the relative risk of being the first one to blink is different for every single seat at the table because you have a different number of picks between this pick and your next pick. So it's this ever-evolving thing. And I actually kind of intentionally stayed out of it. You know, I took those early triomes, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to have all these triomes here to fix my mana. I'm going to play this Booster Tutor. I want to be able to cast whatever I get off Booster Tutor, so I'm going to be splashing a lot of colors. Prismatic Vista is not great for splashing, you know, your 4th and 5th colors. It's much better for fixing mana in a 2-color deck. So I kind of like checked out of this discussion. I didn't want to be involved in it. But I think the reason they went at this point is like kind of incidental. It's just whoever blinked first. I don't think it's a reflection of the evaluation of the table in the
But part of what I'm saying is if we compare that to repeated drafts of a cube, or, you know, maybe to talk about it a different way, the metagame in a cube, I think that is really similar. Like, I think you are still playing chicken about at what point in a draft do I need to take these certain effects. It's just much harder to see because that game of chicken is happening over many, many iterations in that sort of like slow feedback loop.
Well, but there's two things that are different though. There's the open information, which I think changes it because you don't know when you're drafting closed information who's going to be the one to blink.
Right, you're playing a game of statistics. You're sort of saying, well, I kind of know when people evaluate these, and I know if I don't take this now, I'm not going to see another one.
Right, but I'm arguing that's different than this. I don't think that the statistical average of when Prismatic Vista should go would come out to 8 or 9. Because the other thing is different.
Everything is exactly the same.
Everything in the world is exactly the same.
All right, great.
The other thing that's very different here specifically is that you get to pick from the entire cube. I mean, there's plenty of picks in your cube I would take over Prismatic Vista, but there's very few packs I'll take something other than a Vista over it because the pack is broken down in some random way. So that noise means that the actual points at the draft where Prismatic Vistas go in a closed information draft are not consistent because if I have nothing in my colors, I'm definitely taking a Prismatic Vista. Or if I haven't committed to a second color yet, I'm almost certainly going to take Prismatic Vista over anything that's not in my main color because I want the flexibility to stay open. So it's always other variables in play there that are completely removed when you get to take from the entire cube and it's all open information. But I guess I'm trying to get a better grasp of let's assume, I'll stop arguing with you. Let's assume that you're correct, that we're seeing
a bold
transparently
assumption.
We're seeing transparently what's happening, you know, behind closed doors in any closed information draft. What do you glean from that? Like, what does that mean for you?
I mean, really just that like your pick of like the things that are number one in your pick order don't necessarily need to correspond with exactly how powerful you rank the cards. And you can actually move cards down your pick order, even if you think they're more powerful, if you're still just appropriately rating them just a little bit higher than other players are.
Power levels are really
because
is a land powerful ever? I mean, maybe, I guess.
Well, powerful in the sense that it contributes positively to your win percentage.
Right. I guess the mapping of power level to pick order, I agree, is not, you know, linear. It's not like the higher powerful thing is always a higher pick because there's also the questions of openness.
You know where I totally agree with you, though, is that first picking lands in a lot of cubes makes you feel very clever, and it makes your deck better. But I kind of think it's a lot less fun than drafting huge dragons and bombs.
For sure. And to be clear, I didn't enter this draft with the plan to take land super early. It was the fact that I took Booster Tutor, and then everybody kind of jumped in some lanes, and I felt very like nobody else was apparently trying to stay open really at all. I mean, I guess Drafter 2 had taken 2 colorless cards at least, but they were 2 colorless cards that were leaning very hard in a low to the ground creature heavy direction. I just felt like I don't know how things are shaking out here. I want to see what happens after a whole nother round of the table before I start committing to things. And
for sure,
I didn't go into this trying to say I'm going to take lands, and I resent the suggestion that it feels clever. I think it. I mean,
of course it does. Pack 1 Scalding Tarn feels great.
Well, that's not clever. That's just good in almost any environment.
but what I'm just saying is that
I think Pack 1 shock lands is a much more interesting conversation because I will basically never take a shock land. I know many cube drafters that will absolutely take a shock land and rate them very, very highly. I'm just not all about that life.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I just mean to say that I think that was another success to me about this draft was that, you know, I'm not as much of a spike as maybe I should be. I do like to play spiky, but also it's fun to play with splashy things. And just saying, yeah, it is optimal in this environment to just take Kess or Gonti or Feather was really satisfying and exciting to see the decks that people were drafting.
I'm not gonna let you bully yourself out of saying you're a spike. I know you. You absolutely are a spike. You want to get better at the game. Your aim is to win. It doesn't mean you can't appreciate other aspects of the game. You're not a pure spike through and through, but
no one is.
You get to wear that label as far as I'm concerned.
So something I thought about, you know, I mentioned before I got a little bit spooked out of taking green cards, and that was really, you know, I had a list of like, here are my possible double picks here in Seat 8, and a lot of them were green cards, but because the player next to me took a green card first, I ended up shying away from that. And I think that actually might have been a mistake. And here's my logic. In a normal retail draft, there's a huge power delta between the most powerful and least powerful cards. So it's very important to be not just in a color that's open at the table, but that's a color that the players right next to you aren't taking, because you're never going to get those top tier cards because they're going to be taking the first and second or whatever picks out of that pack. Here, where there's
you're never
a much...
getting Goldspan Dragon if your person passing to you is in red. It's just never happening under any circumstances.
Here, even though we have talked about, like, there's some power delta here, it's not as big of a difference if the person next to me is taking, you know, the green card that's a quarter of a grade more powerful than the next most powerful green card than the person that's all the way across from the table. So I think it's actually much more important in a rotisserie draft, or, you know, honestly, I wonder maybe just in cubes that have a somewhat flat power level delta altogether, if it's much more important just to be in the colors that are most open, regardless of where the other players in those card colors are in terms of seat order.
Yeah, I think so. You're saying you don't think the seat positioning really affects openness as much because you're not just trying to get the upper crust of cards. You're happy to get any playables, and you want the most agency in your picks by having the most cards in your colors to choose from.
Right. So I'd rather be, you know, if there's two players across from me that are both in red, and one player that's next to me being green, and those are the only players in those colors, I'd still rather be in green so that I'm not, you know, the third person competing for a color.
But you're saying in retail limited, you might want to be in red because you then get to get all the bomb rares that are all the seats between you and those two players across the table that get opened in those packs.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I never thought about that before, but I think that's probably true. I think it also probably depends on the limited format. You know, the
totally.
Our
I mean,
friends,
it's
our friends at Limited Resources have their definitions of formats as either Prince or Pauper formats, depending on whether the format hinges on your bombs and rares and mythic uncommons, or whether the format hinges upon just the bread and butter commons. And I think the more that your deck success hinges on commons, the less that this matters, and the more you're drafting.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
A regular cube. And I also, it's hard for me to imagine.
It's never one or the other. It's always some like flavor, some balancing between the two, and complicated bell curves of stuff. And I think that might also extend as well to some, especially higher powered cubes, where like you really need certain like payoff cards. Like you need your Crater Hoof to make your green deck work. If that's the case, maybe you do kind of really need to make sure that people around you aren't fighting for those same kind of really key pivotal cards.
Yeah, it definitely depends how the cube is designed. This is a nice theory, but in practice, you could never identify from the packs to this granular detail what was open or not. Or do you think you could?
Oh no, definitely not.
Yeah. It's a nice idea, but I'm never like that player is the green player. I'm always just like,
I guess where
green
you
feels
can
like it's
evaluate
drying
it
up.
more is just that you can put a fair amount of stock in what you get ninth pick and really leverage that to possibly like shift or direct you in a draft.
Yeah, I still feel tilted about the last paper draft we did of my cube before the now times happened. We were down No Land Beyond, and I got a third pick, Birds of Paradise in pack 1, and I was like, there's never been a more clear sign that green is open. This is probably my personal number one top pick in green in the entire cube. It's fantastic. I was like, there's no way these two players past me are in green. And so I like moved pretty hard on green and like took it as a hard signal. And it turns out the player passing to me had taken a Raphaelos and just thought Raphaelos was enough better than Birds of Paradise, which I actually don't agree with. I think Birds is a little better, but maybe that's just me. Anyway, I got punished hard for trying to read signals that way.
Yeah, Raphaelos is pretty committal, but it's a strong card.
He makes a lot of mana, it turns out.
All right, next lesson learned. We're getting down to the dregs. I've definitely
These have all been very
experienced...
heady lessons so far. These are all like, you're excited that this element of the draft has had the curtain pulled back and revealed, and you can now see the game of chicken that happens in card evaluation and how you can possibly evaluate whether or not you care whether the players drafting your colors are sitting next to you or across the table. Did you have any hard evaluation things you learned? Anything where you were like, you know what, this card just is bad, I'm cutting it, or this card's too strong, it can't stick around?
No.
Damn. Deep in the theory.
I was so excited just to see the way the draft sort of went. This is more just a play experience one, though. I've definitely had this experience, less so as my cube has evolved and improved, and also as our play group has just gotten a little bit more experience with it. But definitely people have in the past been like, well, why are you playing all these bad cards? You should put in the good cards. This makes no sense. And
how often has that actually happened? I think it happens in your head.
This is not true. There are haters out there, and you know what? They are gonna hate. But I heard zero hating in this experience, and my theory is when you open up a pack of 15 cards from this cube, it's so easy to look at that like random subset and be like, well, here's a shock and a lightning strike. Why can't I have lightning bolt? Like, I'm going to lose on the back of the fact that I didn't open a better card. Here, this was like the absolute like playground for people to be spikes. Here's the entire cube. Everyone is pitted against everyone. There's no real variance in the same way that opening up packs provide. It's just up to you to figure out what is the best pick. And people really embraced that and did their best, and that was a lot of fun to watch.
To the extent that anyone has criticized the card quality in your cube, I don't think they were criticizing Shock or Lightning Strike. I think they were probably criticizing, well, I don't know, Puppet Conjurer or other cards like that. And it's a similar point, right? You open a pack of 15 cards and you say, why are these two cards even in the pack?
Totally.
They're garbage. What do they even do? And to be clear, I've gotten that in my cube too, even though my cube is much higher power level. People still are going to say this no matter what your cube is, frankly, in my opinion.
Yeah, you're totally right. It cuts both ways. You can say like, well, my draft went badly because my first pack was half garbage. But yeah, that experience is completely eliminated here in the Rotisserie draft.
Right, or it'd be silly to look at the entire cube and go, why is this here? It's like, just ignore it. There's 400 cards. You only get 40 of them. Just don't even touch it.
That's hard to express in a booster draft. Like, well, if you think green is crap, don't draft green. Problem solved. But that's hard to communicate.
Put that one on a pin. You think it sucks? Don't draft it.
Yeah, for sure. So you wanted to talk about card evaluation, and there are definitely a lot of cards that didn't get picked. It is kind of interesting, usually when we've done rotisserie drafts, they've been of 360 card cubes and 45 picks, so every card gets picked. Here, there was a little bit of extra cards. We're at 419 cards, I think. So that just means there's going to be extra cards, and I think that just makes everyone's deck a little bit more powerful. You're not fighting quite as hard in terms of just like pure number of cards in your colors to make playables. So that was a small thing. But more importantly, I just think that there's a lot of cards that we might look at and say, well, these were left on the table. Nobody wanted to put these in their deck. It would be really easy to say those are bad cards. We should cut them from the cube and replace them with something that's more effective. But this cube really isn't designed to be rotisserie drafted. I would agree if that was the main intention. Like, I would still want to maximize the equity of all of the cards in the cube and make sure they had a home somewhere and there was a reason someone would play them sometimes. But we do have a reason why people would play them sometimes in a booster draft or in a grid draft, which is how this cube is mostly played, because sometimes you just don't get all the cards you want. And making these kind of flexible cards that sort of fill in your, 22nd, 23rd slot in the deck, I think is something that I aim to make still interesting and dynamic. So I'm okay with a lot of these cards that are lower power.
I always felt like I've done rotisserie drafts of my own cube, and also the Degenerate Micro Cube we did a rotisserie draft of, which I thought was a really interesting experience too. And the cards that don't get picked or get picked late enough that they're only going to be sideboarded, I feel like I can always look at the card, and the fact that it didn't get picked is a new data point on it, right? It's a new piece of information to evaluate. And oftentimes you just say, well, this is a sideboard card. It's not meant to be picked very highly. Or it's a card I intentionally have a lot of redundancy for, but all the players in those colors got enough of that effect they didn't need this last version of it, and that's fine. Or you just say, this is a card that nobody was drafting in the deck, this card goes in, which can also be totally fine. I don't think most cubes only have 8 or less viable decks. You probably have some decks that nobody could draft at your table at a given draft, so that's also totally fine. But there could be some cards down there where it's like, well, it doesn't fit in any of those categories. Like, actually, this card it could have theoretically gone, or I, as the designer, think this card belongs in 2 of my players' decks, but neither of them wanted it. They didn't even take it as a sideboard card. And then why is that? And then do you agree with the reasons why they did or didn't take it? And you can use that to kind of inform how you think about and design your cube. But I agree, it's not. I don't think it's at all a justification for just axing things.
Right. And in addition to the fact that you don't have that variance, which kind of forces you to play some worse cards, also, like we said, people were much more willing to commit to these very narrow, or maybe not narrow, but very focused strategies and specific archetypes. And that also just meant that some of the more like flexible cards, which, if you need it to fill in this or that, or it's just fine if you're like, well, I'm just, trying to curve out and smash. Those cards
that's another category. That's another great example of a category of cards where it's like, this is a very flexible card that goes into a lot of strategies, but it's not the best at anything. What it's here to do is grease the draft a little bit and make it so that people aren't stuck with unplayables. People can choose to take flexible picks to stay open for a while longer. None of those things are really relevant in this kind of draft. You just aren't going to play those lower tier flexible cards over the higher tier stuff you have access to because you have access to the whole cube.
Exactly, yeah. So I think a lot of the cards that are there definitely fall into those categories. So this is actually helpful. The more I'm thinking about it, like, some specific things I saw were one drafter very much had a zombie theme, And there's a couple zombies that went very late, or they didn't actually end up putting them in their deck at all. And I think it's largely a matter, from talking about it with them, that just the curve doesn't quite work, and maybe there needs to be a few more 2-mana zombies and a few less 3-mana ones, just because their curve wouldn't work if they took all of the 3-mana zombies that the cube offered. Similarly, like Flux Channeler, this has been it's never been a card in the cube.
I don't think I've ever seen anybody cast it.
I haven't either.
It's been in the cube.
It's so easy to imagine it could do something, but blue just isn't doing enough of what it does, and it's sort of like a 3-card combo. So yeah, some of the things that sort of like signal synergies that clearly none of these people were interested in, even when they're going deeply into these synergistic decks, those are things that I'm sort of going to take that as a bigger, more informative or more emphatic data point.
In the case of Flux Channeler, too, it's a difference of the competition it's up against. Like, you do have Young Pyromancer in your cube, and it's like, why would I pay 1 more mana for a version of this that only gives me a payoff if I have other very specific cards in my deck as well? It's so many more hoops to jump through for less reward than just playing Young Pyromancer. And obviously, it's a different color and everything, but, I think it's a question of, like, bringing all these things into balance, and Flux Channeler is just in a weird spot.
Yeah, and it is, again, it's a card that I love. I really enjoyed it in War of the Spark, but the context is really important, and there's just
context.
It's just a little bit too narrow.
You don't have planeswalkers as the problem.
Oh.
That was really why it worked in War of the Spark, I think. I mean, obviously there's counters and stuff,
sure.
like +1/+1 counters, but the thing that made it flexible enough, especially in blue, I think, to be viable was the planeswalkers.
Right. All right, one more lesson. Going back to the issue of people being a little bit turned off of green, I wonder if we have a whole nother facet, a whole nother area where we can try and apply the vanilla test.
Great. I love a new vanilla test.
The vanilla test applies to everything. It's basically just like try and notice your biases and fix them is what the vanilla test is.
Yeah, well, the first step of the vanilla test is how does this creature's stats line up for its CMC? The second step of the vanilla test is how good would this card be if it didn't have a 7-mana planeswalker on the back? And now you're going to give us the third step of the vanilla test. What is it, Anthony?
Well, I'm just wondering if I definitely agree there are a couple green cards which just on power level don't quite make it. And do you think people would look at the green section and they kind of, instead of saying, well, I only need to take 23 of them to make my deck, instead they look at the whole thing and kind of take an average?
I think this is a good one, Anthony. I think I agree.
So, I mean, it's the same.
You're saying someone recognizes 4 or 5 cards in a section, and they're like, I don't think those cards are any good. I don't see why I want to play them. They see that as a knock on the entire color, when actually the bottom 4 or 5 cards don't matter. You won't take them for your deck. What you should be looking at is what are the payoffs for being in this color? What are the top 5 to 10 cards in this color that I would want, and do I want to be in that color? I think this is definitely a thing. I think you've touched on something here.
The vanilla test strikes again.
So vanilla. This is the French bean vanilla test. Don't let a couple little French beans in a whole section ruin the flavor.
Those are just fake in ice cream. Well, I mean, they're not fake. It's not important.
It's not going to be. You've gone on about this before. I'm sure in like Haagen-Dazs French bean, they're just sticking like some sawdust they dyed brown in the ice cream and calling it French bean. But I'm also sure there is some artisanal ice cream out there that does actually have real chunks of bean in it.
Yeah, it could be. The funny thing is, it is vanilla bean, but it's not adding any flavor. They completely separate the vanilla, and they have vanilla extract, and they have pulp, which they label as vanilla bean matter and sell it to ice cream companies. And it's completely flavorless. Yeah, it's sawdust, you're right.
But again, for some of them, I've made vanilla bean ice cream in my own home, and I did it with some of the bean chunks in there. That was definitely adding flavor to it.
There
so
you
go. It is possible.
No, in the best case, it can work.
Anyway, I think it's a good vanilla test. Yeah, I think that's hard not to fall into that trap of you look at a cube for the first time, or even a cube you drafted a couple times, and say, well, I don't want to play these cards, but you don't have to. I mean, even if you're, if we're looking at a 360 cube that has 40 to 50 cards in a color, even if you're in that color, you're probably only playing 10 of those cards, 12 of those cards. Like, you're going to be in a 2-color deck, you're going to have artifacts or colorless cards. Like, you're not playing very many of those cards. You don't need that many for your deck to be good. To that point, I'm really the only player, again, there's that one player splashing a tiny bit of green, and I actually know for a fact that this other player that took exactly 2 green cards is main decking one of them, even though he took it in round 36 here. I'm really the only player playing green, really, like main deck, that I am main decking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 green cards. You've got, 60 green cards in your cube? I'm playing 9 of them, and I'm like the green drafter. So it does not take many cards for that to make a good deck.
Totally. I think if we wanted to break it down sort of mathematically, we could describe it as failing to use the vanilla test is looking at the mean or the median rather than looking at the ceiling.
Yes, I would agree. Though I'm also not sure you're supposed to look at only the ceiling.
Maybe it's more like you need to look at the...
You gotta look at the top,
the mean
the top
of the
10%
part
of the
that
floors.
actually matters.
It's true. You gotta look at that meaty part of the curve, the part that really matters to your deck building. And
the meaty mean. How do you feel about your deck?
Boy, I had a real rough night of Magic last night, as you know. I thought my deck was good. I was happy with how my draft went. I have a very... I'm always, in the case of, Rotisserie draft, I'm looking as much at everyone else's list as I am my own. I'm trying to figure out, how do I beat this player? What are the cards they have that are going to be big problems for me? And so I'm thinking about my matchups the entire time I'm drafting. And I have some matchups I think are good, and some I think are a little bit more suspect. And I played 2 matches last night with my deck, and my deck did nothing, Anthony. It just did absolutely nothing. I can't even, I was so frustrated because I couldn't even explain why. I got mana screwed in one game, but the other games, I drew my cards. I drew cards that ostensibly I thought should have been good against my opponents, and it just never really mattered. It never seemed to work, which was kind of frustrating.
I hate that. You know when I know I hit that feeling is when I'm like, oh, I haven't really done much in this game, and then I look up and my opponent has 3 more cards in their hand than I do. It's like, well, how did we get here?
That is a horrible feeling, and it happens a lot, where it's like, shit, we're at parity on board, and you have 4 more cards in hand than me, and I have not gotten 2 for 1. I didn't mulligan. What happened?
Where did the cards go?
How did this become a thing? So yeah, my deck did nothing last night, and I didn't really know why. It was very, very frustrating. It was also frustrating because I was getting Gontied with Ephemerated Gontied, and my opponent cast the first Booster Tutor. Nothing was going my way. I wanted to kill this Corpse Knight with a Murderous Red Cap, but it turns out you're playing the misprint version of Corpse Knight, so it actually has 3 toughness. Everything was going wrong. That was painful. And today, I played against another player that was previously undefeated, and I won that match, though they got mana screwed in one game. But the second game went well, and my deck did what I thought it should do. So I don't know. I thought I had drafted a deck that had a good combination of mass removal. I have a couple of board wipes, 1 small board wipe and 1 real board wipe. And then I have a fair amount of targeted removal and interaction. A lot of beefy mid-range stuff and high-value stuff that can give me just, lots of accrued value over time. My idea being that I want to win on the value axis, and I have to stop anybody who's going to beat me on the tempo axis with these cheap removal spells and efficient blockers and whatnot. And I got to do these cool things, I feel like this is the kind of stuff you can do in Rotisserie Draft that rarely comes together in Paper Draft, where, I have a Drown in Sorrow in my deck, which is a 3 mana, -2/-2 board wipe in black. And I just have almost no creatures that it kills. I mean, I have cheap creatures, but they're all 1/3s or 2/3s. I have just all 3 toughness things, so I can always cast that. I don't have to worry about not playing my cheap stuff out before I cast my Drown in Sorrow. So I have kind of that stuff going on. And I don't know. We'll see how the rest of the matches go. I think one of my worst matchups is going to be you, unfortunately. I think your deck is...
I see you highlighting Reclamation Sage.
I did. You're playing this artifact deck, and late in the draft, I did take a couple of targeted artifact removal spells, thinking maybe this will help. But I'm not sure it's going to be enough.
Really close to actually just hate drafting those, doing a couple, 4 picks, let's try and get rid of these effects. And ended up just sort of realizing, well, actually, I'd rather just, have Archaeo Mender and Macabre Waltz and, have some redundancy and ways to buy back things. And that's going to be, a better sideboard option against a greater variety of different decks. And I think I'm going to be happy with that decision in the end.
Yeah, your list is going to be, I think, a challenge for me to beat. But we will see, because you are going to beat me on the value axis because of the combined synergy value of your cards. Individually, you don't have very many cards that are well, this is a 3-for-1 or a 4-for-1. It's that when you combine your Traxos with your Steel Overseer and your Scrap Trawler and all your little dinky artifact creatures, all of a sudden you're going to build this engine that's going to be worth more than the sum of the cards, which is going to be a challenge. And that was one of the games I lost last night, was to this Aristocrats deck, which I had great blockers, and it didn't matter because they just played Gravecrawler 4 times a turn and drained me for 8 with their little creatures, and I had removal spells for them, but they had redundancy, and so I couldn't kill the Corpse Knight and the Cruel Celebrant and the Blood Artist, and I just lost pretty badly. I think our match is going to be somewhat similar, frankly.
Yeah. I say this in a good way because this is very much my intention, but I've only played one match, but I've observed a lot of matches, and the games are extremely complicated in a way that I think is really fun and rewarding. Playing against the same Aristocrats deck, it was really hard to try and balance what are the pieces I actually need to remove from the board that are actually going to kill me before I can outvalue, and stabilize on the board. And when
That
they have
was a
that kind of
complicated game between you and the Aristocrats deck that I watched last night.
yeah, and I messed up and I still won, and I regret that. I should have been punished.
Did you just pinch yourself a couple times just so you'd have a negative association with your mistake?
I did, yeah. Don't cast more spells. Go.
Stop trying to be mana efficient.
Keep up your interaction. No, I mean, it's just ended up being this really complicated line of I really needed to, like, cast another artifact and then sacrifice my Perilous Myrrh, which had been blocked but not killed because they were able to sacrifice something, but if I had sacrificed it to Sai, I could use it to kill their Blood Artist, which meant they didn't have one draw that would have killed me.
Yes.
I missed that.
I witnessed this exact board state, and it was a complicated one, I agree. My games have not been that complicated. Maybe that's just the way my deck works. My deck is trying to either stop them from doing their complicated thing or just brute force some value plays. I drafted an extremely modal deck. I should count the number of modal cards I have in my deck, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
This is good. This is quality content.
This is good stuff.
Welcome to counting.
11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 15 explicitly modal spells. Spells that have 2 explicit modes you can do, not counting stuff that is effectively modal, like, a burn spell or whatever, that can do multiple different things. 15 spells that actually have 2 different sets of rules text on them, which is a lot. It's a whole lot of things I can do. So I like that about my deck. I expect it to be pretty consistent. The one game I got Mana Stream was, I think, going to be an anomaly. My mana fixing is very, very good, so I think that was just bad luck looking down on me. Yeah, my deck does not have explosive potential, nor does it have a powerful synergy thing going on. It's just the good cards and trying to put them together to make a deck work.
Well, I'm excited to see you draft a Persist combo next time.
I shouldn't have announced it. It'll be long enough time will pass between this and our next rotisserie draft that I can force it.
I'll let you have it. I'm not going to fight you for it.
I'm honestly just curious to see how good it can be, because I don't know. I don't know how good it can be, because you don't have tutors. Tutors are nice for any combo deck. I think you basically have to draft the Aristocrats deck that this Aristocrats player drafted, but then also get Metallic Mimic and Masticore and Murderous Redcap, and then you have like an Aristocrats deck with this out to an infinite combo.
Right. I think the way that you both structure your mana so that you can play a game of Magic still, and then also structure the sort of way you're supporting those build-arounds so that the fail case for those cards is still, a deck that does something is really important.
All right, so the summary of this episode is everyone should do a rotisserie draft. It will lead you to have a series of very heady and theoretical revelations like Anthony had. That will they be applicable to anybody listening? Who knows? But they're very interesting, that's for sure. But we highly recommend Roto Drafts. It's a lot of fun, and I'm excited to play these games out and see how the records end up shaking out. Now, we only played, maybe a quarter or a fifth of the overall matches that are going to be played, Anthony. What would you, as the Cube designer, what would you consider an ideal spread of records for this?
What do you mean by that? Like, do I want to see one person just steamroll everybody versus everybody having some wins, some losses?
Yeah, do you think that, your ideal Cube environment would have, everybody went, 4-3 or 3-4? Or do you think your ideal Cube environment would be, there's a couple people that, only lost one match, they're 6-1 or 5-2? Do you have a sense of what you'd be more or less happy with, or you don't really care?
I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. I mean, I've definitely thought about, I don't want a lot of games that just feel like non-starters, where one player just feels like they have completely no way to win against a certain deck.
I don't know, theoretically, your opponent just, plays a Krenko on turn 3 and then turn 4 cast Domri's Ambush on it. Just something like that, theoretically.
Yeah, that's a great example. And your deck has no removal in it. That would really do it.
I have lots of removal. I will not tolerate this slander. We're putting it in the show notes. People will see.
Well, you didn't draw it. You chose.
Removal.
You should have drawn it.
I should have mulliganed to it. I didn't know my opponent was going to go Krenko on a Domri's Ambush.
At the same time, I don't want to. I feel like seeing a sort of more even mix of wins and losses could also signify just very much like a higher variance environment, or that same sort of thing of lots of kind of rock paper scissors matchups. Yeah, so I don't know.
Yeah, when I've done this in my cubes, I like to see. I don't like to see somebody that 7-0s, right? That, unless somebody's a much, much, much better player.
Right, because on the other hand, people are really able to draft very much a specific archetype and get into a lane. So also seeing someone just go 7-0 means, well, there's one archetype that's just very overpowered.
And we all missed it when we were watching the draft happen in front of us, which is not a great sign either. Yes,
So
but I
those
do like to
kinds of-
see some 6 and 2s and some 2s and 6s though. Like I want to see. I would not be thrilled if it was all 4 and 3s and 3 and 4s. That to me would signify, like you said, either there's just a lot of variance here, and whether you have a good or bad deck is not really affecting your win percentage that much, or it signifies that we have polarized matchups where this deck can beat all these kinds of decks and can't beat other kinds of decks. And I mean, ultimately, the record of a specific, set of matches from one rotisserie draft is nowhere near enough data to determine any of this. So it's just, kind of a fun game to like see what the records end up being. But I think like if you were to do 100,000 rotisserie drafts, I would not want, a 3-4, 4-3 record spread. I would want there to be more range, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. I had a small question for you. You mentioned before the draft that I was definitely going to be cutting a lot of cards after this draft, and I think you were implying that you were going to crush us with certain cards you think are overpowered. Is that the case?
Oh, no, that's not what I was implying at all.
Oh.
What I specifically said was, I think I said, I'm sad to think of all the good cards Anthony's going to cut after this draft. And what I did not mean is all my cards are great and I'm going to make you cut them. What I meant was, I think a lot of cube designers that are power maxing their cube, when something like this happens, their goal will be to cut some of the stuff that proved to be underperforming and people didn't like and weren't drawn to. But you, as somebody that is curating a medium power list, are, I think, just as likely to cut stuff off the top. And so I thought it was very likely that 6 of the 8 of us would have drafted some cards that you were like, you know what, that has just proven to be too good. And again, it gets the axe now, which is it's a funny kind of relationship because, people, I think, draft the decks they like, like they're drafting a deck they like to play to some degree, even if we say like as in evaluate to be a good deck. And then the fact that they could then theoretically be a contributing factor to you nerfing that deck a little bit, which is, I think it's a unique risk of somebody running a lower powered environment where you are more likely to cut things for power level reasons on the high end than the low end.
Yeah, that's fair. So far, everything seems reasonable, but we'll see if we get a bunch more other complaints about Cranko.
We'll do a follow-up next week or the week after when all the drafts are done and just do a quick little check-in on how the draft ended up, any other revelations you had, and if you're making any direct cuts because of things you saw or didn't see. But that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you all for tuning in. I want to make a quick appeal. We do this podcast every week. It's been 35 weeks now. We don't ever ask you to go buy a mattress or set up a Squarespace site or order some boxed wine or whatever.
In fact, do not set up a Squarespace site.
Don't do it. Just don't participate in that whole system. And, no shade to people that do have advertisements on their show. We don't ask you to go do our Patreon. Again, no shade to anybody that does do that stuff, but we don't. But here's what I am going to ask you to do. Just go rate the show on iTunes. Give us 5 stars. Leave a little tiny review that just says, I'd like this Cube podcast, good thoughts about Magic cards, just anything. It really helps out the show a lot. It's the only thing you can do right now concretely to help the show. We have no other ways you can help us other than doing that. So I put it in the show notes this time. Just go click on that. We're also not going to remind you every week. It's the first time I've done this in 3 months. So just go give us a review. I won't have to bug you anymore in the future, but that would be really helpful if you have been enjoying the show, and it means a lot to us. We do read them all. So that's something you can do if you want to help out the show. Thanks to you for listening. Thank you to DJ James Nasty, who produced all of the music for our show. And thank you to Anthony, host of the Rotisserie Draft, for talking about Magic with me.
Can't wait to finish up these games.
I'm stealing your sign-off this week because, first of all, you don't really do a sign-off most weeks. But I do want to give people... We talked about food a little bit last week and got some positive response to our pasta talk. I want to cap the show here with just my quick recipe for pickled onions, which is one of my favorite things to have on hand pretty much all the time. And I've tweaked the recipe over the years. I've tried ones I found online. And it's so simple, though, that I want to make sure everyone knows how to make pickled onions and then puts them on everything that they're eating. You agree with me on pickled onions, right?
Oh, they're excellent.
I feel like it's the kind of food that, I feel like a child would not like pickled onions because it's got pickles and onions. It sounds like the kind of food that kids wouldn't like, but it's really like this little sour candy almost you put on your food. I adore it. So
I mean, it's especially great, all the time, but especially now when you're trying to do a lot of meal prep in advance and, make sure you have lunches and stuff, and it just lets you add some, brightness and exciting flavor to whatever else you're throwing together.
And I love vinegar, so I'm a little biased, but, I throw these, obviously, on, the main thing I use them for is putting them on tacos or something like that. I'll throw them on a pizza. I'll throw them on a salad. I'll just put them on top of some rice with some vegetables. You make a little sweet potato, something, throw some pickled onions on there. They're great on everything. So here's my recipe. It's very simple. You get a red onion. Very important that it's red. You're going to cut it into slivers, long slivers, however you like to do so. I do it always with the grain because it helps the onion keep more of its like snappy texture. If you cut it against the grain into like rings, then it kind of gets all
longitudinally.
Yeah, that's the direction. But if you cut it, if you cut it into like ring shapes, like you cut it, across grain, then it kind of gets real floppy, and it's still fine. And sometimes I will do that if I'm making them for use in a very short period of time, like if I need them for like a meal in a couple hours, because they get more of the vinegar flavor faster that way, I guess, because the like veins are open in them or whatever. But cut them with the grain, long slivers. Then you're gonna put a saucepan on the stove. You're gonna put pure white vinegar in it, the cheapest vinegar you can get. There's no reason, trust me, I've tried. There's no reason to use any kind of fancy vinegar for this. You just want pure white vinegar. The onion flavor is going to come through. You're going to put some white vinegar in the pan, just enough so that when I never measure any of this, so it's not a great recipe, I guess. But you put enough white vinegar in the saucepan that when you pour it out, it can cover the onions completely in like a bowl or a Tupperware or something. So I guess a couple cups, maybe a cup and a half of white vinegar, something like that. Then you do like a little bit of sugar. I do a couple tablespoons, probably maybe a tablespoon of sugar, just some sugar in there. And I like to put black peppercorns and, importantly, 1 pod of star anise in my vinegar. So you've got sugar, black pepper, and star anise, and then you heat that up to a boil. Let it boil for a couple minutes or however long. It doesn't really matter. But just make sure you heat it up to a boil, get all that sugar dissolved in there. Take it off the heat, pour it over the onions in some kind of dish, do it in a Tupperware, a ball jar, a mixing bowl, doesn't matter. And then I like to let it come to room temperature before I put it in the refrigerator, just because I feel like that helps get more flavors in it and you stick it right in the refrigerator. So let it come to room temperature, then stick it in the refrigerator, and that'll keep for easily a couple weeks, probably longer if you, put it in a sealed container that seals well like a Tupperware, and just put it on everything. It's great. I highly recommend it.
Gotta be honest, they're delicious, but that's kind of a rough recipe. Let's get some numbers in the next one.
Oh, I thought you were saying I made them wrong. You just wish I had numbers. Oh, here you go. 1 whole red onion, cup and a half of white vinegar, tablespoon of sugar, 2 teaspoons of black peppers, 1 pod star anise.
Perfect.
There we go.
Tune in next week for our next episode of Lucky Pickle Radio. Too much shit on my desk.
Me too,
All right,
buddy.
what am I going to fiddle with? Should I fiddle with this pencil or this ball of magnets? Let's put
whatever you want.
Away. Clicky, clicky, clicky pencil.
That's a noisy thing to fiddle with.
Shit.
Did you break it?
No, it's just noisy. You're right. I won't click it.
Oh, you're gonna get some pen clicking blue balls while you're on this podcast episode.
All right, I'm going to click it one time. Okay, now if I have to write with it, I can.
All right, great. I mean, it's okay if it clicks once if you have to write something. That's fine.
Okay, I'm going to have to write a lot of things down.
Have you been recording this whole time?
Yes.
Great. I have a great outro for the show then.